Chapter 2. Escape. 3 nights later, Sans woke with a jerk. Someone in the next room was sobbing. It wasn't a memory or a nightmare, he realized a moment later, and it wasn't the priestess. It was a small child, crying so hard that it could barely breathe. Steeling himself, the boss monster slid out of bed and listened intently. He heard a woman whisper something, and the child's sobs quieted as a familiar sound came through the door. It was the same humming that had depowered his blaster the other day, though not the same tune. The skeleton took a moment to be sure that the glow in his eyes was out, then cracked the bedroom door open. Frisk was kneeling, bareheaded, with her arms around a little boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years. In the light of one lamp on the work table, Sans saw a dark patch of blood in the child's hair. Frisk glanced at the skeleton, giving him a wan smile, still humming. Sans closed the door enough that the child wouldn't see him. The priestess waited till the boy had calmed down to the occasional sniffle, then leaned back and reached for something on the table.
"I've got a treat for you,"
she said cheerfully.
"Do you like peppermint?"
The child thought it over and nodded.
"Wonderful, because that's exactly what this is. You'll feel better in no time."
She held out a glass bottle.
"You can have 3 big swallows, but only 3, all right?"
Well played, Sans thought, framing it as something he got to have, not something he had to take. Sure enough, the little boy gulped it right down, smacking his lips as the young woman retrieved the bottle.
"Good. Can you do something very important for me?"
she asked. The child nodded.
"Can you lie down and count to 100? That'll make the magic work better." "Let's go to my office."
The child went with her quite willingly. After a few minutes, the High Priestess re-emerged into Sans' field of vision. Her pleasant expression was gone, replaced with one that actually made him feel a little sorry for whoever had pissed her off. Then he remembered the blood on the kid's head.
"Anybody you want me to kill?"
he asked through the door.
"Don't tempt me."
Frisk jerked a sheet of paper from a stack on the desk, grabbed a pen, and began writing rapidly. Sans checked the time.
God damn, what's that kid doing awake at 2 in the morning?
"Being beaten."
The pen scratched viciously across the page. She began whistling again. Viciously. He decided to shut up. Frisk soon finished the message, blew the ink dry, and folded the paper in thirds, then sealed it and marched to the outer door, where she woke up the guard on duty. Sans heard her reaming the guy about doing his job properly, serving a writ, and not letting a guy out of the castle. She came back in, only to return to the office. This seemed to be typical for her, as far as Sans could tell, though it usually wasn't this dramatic or this late at night. If she wasn't off at church or giving him lessons, she was talking to someone who needed help and apparently couldn't get it elsewhere. He had yet to see her do something for fun or sleep more than 5 hours at a time. Meanwhile, his daily routine had been surprisingly low-key. The first day, after being flagrantly mind-controlled into agreeing to stay, he'd eaten some more, then slept for another dreamless 24 hours. The next morning, she'd let him have another pile of food, then started his apprenticeship by showing him the most common ingredients for potions and how to identify them by sight, as he couldn't smell and didn't have much sense of touch. Yesterday had been a review, emphasizing that a mistake could literally kill someone, and she'd given him a book of basic recipes, asking him to make a list of any ingredients he found that she hadn't already introduced. It was kind of annoying to have homework, and he was starting to get cabin fever, but otherwise, the whole experience hadn't been too terrible. He was relieved and disappointed that she kept the veil on almost all the time, which reduced the distractions somewhat, though she persisted in having a fantastic shape, and he was really starting to enjoy the sound of her voice. He didn't even mind the constant humming or whistling anymore, except when he felt the barriers pulse in time with whatever she was doing, and realized that she was strengthening them every so often. But when he could focus enough to ask questions, she was patient and encouraging, and let him use all the paper he wanted to write down the answers. She was obviously pleased that he cared enough to take notes, though not in a smug or irritating way. It just made her happy, and that made him not unhappy. It was also still novel to talk to a human who wasn't afraid of him. He hadn't seen many humans up here besides the little boy, and figured they were forbidden to come into her rooms unless they desperately needed help or could sneak past a sleeping guard. That was fine with Sans, though he'd overheard one cleaning lady being so persistent that he really wanted to come out of the bedroom and tell her to piss off. Unsurprisingly, Frisk had asked him to not do that. There were only a few real mysteries so far. One was a pile of letters she'd brought in on the second day and tossed into a basket of also unopened envelopes standing by the roaring fireplace in her workshop. He'd caught her looking at the basket a couple times, as if debating whether to burn them all, but she never did it, or opened any in front of him. The biggest question was how she knew he could teleport, and the nature of his blue magic, even if it was getting more red than blue these days. He had unthinkingly used the ladder to grab a couple things yesterday, and his magic had almost immediately died out. He didn't know exactly how she was doing it, but her barriers weren't just blocking him in. They kept his power so muted that he couldn't have summoned a single bone. It seemed that he'd be allowed to use some magic to make the actual potions, and that was it. Well, there was time to worry about that later. The injured kid had made him think of Chris again, which made him think of the book passage Frisk had quoted at him. He'd have to ask if she... Wait, no, he didn't have to ask. She'd given him carte blanche to read anything he found in her bedroom or workshop. Sans tapped the nearest witchlight on, noting that it was much weaker than the ones underground, and started perusing the shelves. 15 minutes later, Frisk knocked on the door, waiting for him to grunt acknowledgement before she came in.
I'm sorry for waking you.
She said, dropping into her chair with a deep sigh.
There's going to be hell to pay in the morning.
She did look like hell, with bags under her eyes and a smear of blood on her cheek. Sans put the book down and tapped his own face, and she got the hint, rubbing her cheek with the back of her hand.
Ugh, that poor child.
She sighed again, curling up and resting her head on the arm of the chair.
I'll wash up in a minute.
Didn't you just get back from a thing?
He asked, wondering if she was always this cavalier about bodily fluids.
Yes. His Holiness decided we needed more midnight services, and I have to be there every other night.
She rubbed her eyes.
Flynn must have followed me back here. People aren't supposed to know where I live, but word is spreading. At this rate, I'll have to move again.
Sans drummed his fingertips on the bedpost. She'd found an oversized stool to use in the workshop, but there were no armchairs big enough for him, so he spent most of his leisure time on the bed.
Being High Priestess sucks. How long you been at it?
3 years. The last they was assassinated, and they had to find a replacement as fast as possible. Out of all the minor priestesses available, I was the only one who passed all the tests. It's been instructive.
That didn't surprise him. A human strong enough to block a boss monster's focused attack had to be pretty rare.
How old are you anyway?
He asked, suddenly curious. Her eyes shut.
22. I was educated in a convent, ordained at 16, high priestess at 19.
A mighty yawn was partly hidden in her arm.
Lucky me.
Sans didn't know much about humans, but he was pretty sure that was young as hell for so much responsibility. The problem was that she was good enough to handle it, which meant they'd pile on more and more until she went nuts.
Nah, sucks to be you. Any way you can get out of it?
Well,
She mumbled, eyes still closed.
I can die. Or marry. Or go back to the convent and become the Mother Superior, which would also be until I die. The Feast of All Souls is next week. That's when the last High Priestess was murdered.
Something prickled up Sans' spine.
You spend all your time doing church stuff, kissing babies and healing puppies or whatever. Why the hell would anyone want to kill you?
I meant it when I said I have influence in the church and at court. I don't hate monsters, which is inconvenient for several people, and I'm not quiet about it, which is extremely inconvenient for many more of them. Besides, my natural father is very wealthy, and his other children—
Natural father? What, do some humans have unnatural kids?
Her eyes opened. She looked lovely in the soft light, but troubled and sad, so much that he wished he hadn't asked.
I'm illegitimate. My father never married my mother, and our life was bad. Very hard for a very long time.
The priestess rubbed her fingertips together, as if seeing more dried blood.
He was a very busy man, but he only has one legitimate heir. After his second wife died, he started tracking down his children born out of wedlock. and it's an open secret that he'll leave each of us a large amount after he passes.
And whoever's left gets a bigger piece of the pie?
Exactly. As far as I know, there were 14 or 15 of us, but magic runs in his side of the family, and most of his children became sorcerers. Almost all of my half-brothers have been killed fighting monsters. 2 of my half-sisters blew up in an experiment that went wrong. There are only 6 of us left, including his heir.
Sans' eyes narrowed.
What is it with humans and exploding stuff by accident?
He couldn't read the look on her face.
If we knew the answer to that, history would have taken a much better course.
Of course, that made him think of Chris again. It seemed pretty inevitable, so he might as well ask.
I don't suppose there's a record of the humans who went to the underground on that last trip. Maybe what happened to them after they got back?
Frisk raised her head a little.
That depends. We know exactly which nobles, sorcerers, and other dignitaries attended. Do you mean one of them?
Nah, this was a servant, I think. Probably. I don't know.
The skeleton felt his eyes lighting up again.
He was only 4 or 5. Just coming up on 13 years ago, so he'd be a grown-up by now.
The priestess frowned.
No one that young was in attendance, so far as I know, and I've read every account I could find. May I ask why you want to know?
Nah,
Sans flexed his hand around the bedpost.
forget it.
Frisk sighed, carving a design into the plush chair with her thumbnail.
Well, I'm afraid the answer is no. There's no record of the servants who came along, except the ones who were killed, and that didn't include any children. You'd have to check with each of the...
She sat up.
Wait, I know someone who was there. My mother. Do you want me to ask her?
Hell yes, I do.
Sans' hand tightened, splintering the bedpost. He guiltily released it.
Did she talk much about it? What all did she tell you? Can I ask her a couple of things?
The priestess laughed, quieting him with a wave of her hand.
Sans, please. She's been very sick recently, and I don't want to excite her too much. I will ask her anything you need to know, thank you. And yes, she talked about it to anyone who would listen. She's the one who told me all about monsters and what you're actually like.
Sans sat forward, but she forestalled more questions with another gesture.
First, her name is Rosa. Did you ever meet her?
It did sound familiar.
I think so. Little, blonde, wore the hair up.
That's her. She would have been in charge of any children they brought along, but she never mentioned any of them to me.
Frisk tapped her finger on the chair arm.
She did say there were things she wasn't allowed to talk about. She worked for the Duke as a nurse, and she would never disobey him.
He wondered for a moment if that meant the guy was Frisk's father, but was too excited to dwell on it.
What'd she say about us?
Well, she didn't talk very much with individual monsters, but she said the Queen was very kind, and made sure to tell each of the humans how glad she was to have them visit. The King was also very courteous. He tried his best not to frighten anyone, and he thought it was rude that the servants weren't allowed to eat with the nobles.
Sans' foot started tapping. She raised an eyebrow at him, and he reluctantly stopped.
Who else?
The next moment, they both heard the office door open into the workshop.
Miss?
Frisk was at the bedroom door in an instant.
What is it, Flynn?
She closed the door most of the way. Damn it all to hell. Sans grumpily listened to the child explain that he'd scratched his head, and sorry, there was blood on the couch now. Frisk explained that wounds got itchy as they healed, and to please not scratch it, and that it would be much better to wipe his hands on the towel she'd put down than on the furniture. Then he had to be cleaned up again, and a bigger bandage applied, and someone was sent for to take the boy somewhere he could sleep safely. A thought stabbed at him as he listened to the proceedings. That was how she knew he could teleport and zip things around without touching them. King Asgore had insisted the monsters show off their powers in various amusing ways so that the humans would be less afraid of their magic. Sans thought it was a bad idea at the time, and look what came of it. Frisk eventually came back to the bedroom, drying her hands on her skirt.
Let's cut to the chase.
Sans said quietly as she sat down.
Did she tell you about any skeletons?
Yes,
Frisk folded her hands and looked straight at him.
2 brothers. Sans and Papyrus.
Sans laced his fingers together to avoid accidentally destroying anything else.
And...
She liked them very much, especially Papyrus. Sans was friendly, but she said he watched their every move and it made them nervous. Papyrus was a joy to be around. He was very full of himself, but there wasn't a mean bone in his body, and he considered it his duty to welcome the humans as much as possible. My mother talked about him more than any other monster. Apparently his spaghetti was terrible.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Frisk looked at him sharply.
I wanted to ask you about that, but are you alright?
Sans couldn't answer. He'd avoided thinking too much about home, especially the fact that he'd already been gone for a week when he got caught. It had been easy to tell himself that he could always bust out of here if he needed to, or that the lady would let him send a message, or even go have a quick visit before coming back here. But...
Are you Papyrus's brother?
Yeah.
The priestess shook her head.
I don't understand. Mother said that Sans was shorter than any of the humans who came to the underground, and the only boss monsters mentioned in the official histories are Asgore and Toriel. Can you tell me what happened? I wasn't sure if you were the same skeleton. You seem so different.
A lot of shit happens, that's what.
Sans lurched to his feet, and she had to tip her head back to look up at him. His sockets were glowing again.
You know what? I'm tired. And you look like crap. Time for night-night.
He jerked the door open, rattling the hinges.
Good luck cleaning up. Blood's a bitch to get out. Trust me, I know.
She rose quietly, folding her hands in the style he recognized from the very first time he'd seen her.
All right, then. Good night, Sans,
she said, and walked past him out of the room. He didn't slam the door shut behind her, but it was pretty close. Once she had control of herself again, Frisk wiped her eyes and resumed scrubbing the couch. She kept glancing underneath it, and as she threw yet another towel into the laundry basket, she decided,
to hell with it,
and pulled the couch aside. A nearly invisible seam in the floor showed where a board could be pried up to access her hidden safe. There was no lid, no lock, and no key, just a solid golden film that vanished when she pressed her thumb into its center. The High Priestess surveyed the contents: several tight-folded papers, a bag of high-value dinar, a sack of silver ingots, a few pieces of jewelry, and a small box. She selected the box and removed its rosewood lid to reveal a tiny glass orb, something swirling around on its surface like smoke. She stared at it for so long that her knees began aching, but she didn't notice. Her vision blurred again, and she jammed the lid back on the little box, shoving everything back into the safe, resealing it, thumping the floorboard into place, and pushing the couch back. Not today, she told herself fiercely. She didn't care what Sans said or how he acted. It couldn't be worth it. Nothing could.